When we think about the 1960s, most people picture peace and love, open-air festivals, classic records, and bands everyone seemed to worship. But that's only half of the story. Behind the colorful posters and perfect choruses, there was a much more tense side. Waves of boycotts, records burned in public, furious headlines, and an open war against certain bands that were seen as a threat, a joke, or even a national scandal. And that's exactly what we're diving into today in the 10 most hated bands of the 60s and the scandals behind them. Throughout this video, you'll see how some of the most famous names in music, and a few very obscure ones, managed to attract a level of hatred and rejection that feels almost unbelievable today. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive into the hidden stories of music, go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because that really helps this content reach more people. And of course, while you're watching, start thinking about which bands you believe deserve a place on this list and which one you'd still defend to the very end down in the comments. Before we start the countdown, there's one important detail. There's no official list of the most hated bands of the 1960s. What we have here is a snapshot of 3 kinds of hatred all mixed together. Parents and religious groups terrified of drugs, sex, and rebellion, authorities and censors trying to control what young people heard, and fans or critics who felt betrayed by bands they saw as too commercial, too artificial, or just too over the top. In some cases, what began as total devotion ended in outright rejection. With that in mind, let's get to it. And to open this list, we have to start with the band that seemed untouchable, until one badly interpreted quote and a controversial album cover made part of the world turn against them. Number 10. The Beatles, When Love Turned into a Bonfire of Records. Starting this list with the Beatles might sound strange, because today they're treated as almost sacred figures in pop culture. But in 1966, one comment from John Lennon managed to turn devotion into outrage at incredible speed. In an interview, he said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, talking about how powerful pop culture had become in young people's lives. In the UK, that didn't cause much of a stir, but when the quote crossed the Atlantic and was republished in the United States, stripped of context in a tense climate of religious conservatism, everything blew up. Suddenly, Christian radio stations announced boycotts. Broadcasters took Beatles songs off the air. Religious leaders launched campaigns against the band, and record-burning events started appearing. Teenagers who once proudly showed off their LPs appeared in photos tossing vinyl into the flames, as if destroying those albums were an act of faith. The band had to face tense press conferences, issue apologies, explain themselves again and again, and deal with threats that went way beyond normal music criticism. As if that weren't enough, another controversy hit around the same time, the infamous Butcher cover of the album Yesterday and Today. On the original cover, the 4 Beatles wore butcher coats, surrounded by dismembered baby dolls and raw meat. The intention may have been ironic, but to many people it looked offensive, tasteless, and even disturbing. Stores refused to sell the record, the label scrambled to recall the copies and replace the artwork, and that cover became one of the strangest symbols of how quickly the band went from beloved by the world to the center of a moral storm. If even the Beatles managed to become targets of organized hatred, you can imagine what would happen to a band that embraced the villain image from day one.
Number 9. The Rolling Stones, becoming the official villains of the 60s. If the Beatles were seen as the good boys, the Rolling Stones were billed as their complete opposite. Messy hair, dangerous, provocative. That image wasn't just marketing. The band genuinely embraced the role of every conservative parent's nightmare. One of the key moments that solidified this reputation was their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, when they were invited to perform Let's Spend the Night Together. The lyrics sounded too daring for American television, and the producers demanded that Mick Jagger change it to Let's Spend Some Time Together. He complied, but with a look and delivery so ironic that it was obvious how he felt about the censorship. At the same time, the Stones began dominating headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with chord progressions or riffs. In 1967, the famous Redlands bust at Keith Richards' home ended with him and Mick Jagger charged with drug possession. The case turned into a spectacle, moralizing headlines, alarmist editorials, and a wave of criticism claiming they were the perfect example of youth in decline. To many people, the Stones stopped being just a rock band and became a symbol of everything rotten in contemporary culture. On top of that, they released Sympathy for the Devil, sung from the point of view of a narrator who takes on the persona of the devil, wandering through wars and historical tragedies. The artistic intent may have been to comment on the darker side of humanity, but for religious groups, it sounded like a direct flirtation with something forbidden. The mix of scandals, arrests, provocative lyrics, and defiant behavior made the Rolling Stones, in many eyes, the official villains of the 60s. And if society was already scandalized by them, the next case shows what happens when an entire concert crosses the line and turns into a courtroom drama.
Number 8. The Doors, when the stage turned into a crime scene. The Doors always lived on the border between art and chaos. Jim Morrison wasn't just a singer. He came across as a poet, a shaman, and at times a ticking time bomb. In 1969, at a concert in Miami, that mix finally blew apart. Morrison walked on stage visibly altered, started taunting the audience, confronting the police, and playing with the idea of undressing right there in front of everyone. The atmosphere turned into pure confusion, with conflicting reports about what exactly people had seen that night. What wasn't in doubt was the reaction. Morrison ended up charged with obscene behavior, indecent exposure, and language that authorities considered unacceptable. The press turned the episode into a national scandal, and the Doors were suddenly held up as the ultimate example of how perverse and dangerous rock music could be. Some shows were canceled, the band's reputation splintered, and part of the audience that once saw Morrison as a charismatic rebel began to view him as someone who had gone too far. If a single concert could provoke that kind of backlash, what can we say about a song that made adults nervous just by existing? Number 7. Jefferson Airplane, the white rabbit that panicked the adults. Jefferson Airplane were one of the most distinctive voices of the San Francisco scene, blending psychedelia, politics, and intensity. But one particular song put them directly in the moralists' crosshairs, White Rabbit. With its steadily climbing rhythm and lyrics packed with Alice in Wonderland references, the track sounded like a call to open your mind and question everything. For many young listeners, it felt almost hypnotic. For many adults, it was a veiled invitation to experiences they were deeply afraid of. Conservative commentators began accusing the song of encouraging drug use, even though it didn't spell anything out literally. TV shows argued over the real meaning of the metaphors. Politicians complained about what was being played on the air, and some stations thought twice before giving White Rabbit heavy rotation. The band, meanwhile, became more and more associated with the idea of counterculture and a complete break with old values. If a single track was enough to spark a moral panic, imagine the effect of a whole album immersed in dark, urban, almost forbidden themes. Number 6. The Velvet Underground, the band record stores didn't want on their shelves. While some psychedelic groups leaned into color and fantasy, the Velvet Underground preferred to stare at the cold, abrasive side of urban life. On the Velvet Underground and Nico, the band sang about heavy dependence, prostitution, violence, and taboo desires, with a sound that was raw and often uncomfortable.
Nothing about it felt designed to please the mainstream. It was as if each track dragged the listener into a basement no one wanted to admit was there. It's no surprise that part of the music industry reacted with fear and rejection. Some record stores simply refused to stock the album, claiming its content and imagery were too extreme. Certain radio stations avoided anything tied to the record, especially songs like Heroin, which tackled delicate subjects in a direct, dark way, not glamorizing them, but not hiding them either. For years, the Velvet Underground were more feared than celebrated, treated as exactly the kind of band people shouldn't listen to. Ironically, the album later became one of the most influential in history, proving that what's hated in one era can be revered in another. And if the Velvet upset people with pure art, the next group made them even angrier with a mix of obscene humor, protest, and the attention of federal agents.
Number 5. The Fugs, the rock band in the FBI files. The Fugs emerged in the New York underground as a mix of poetry, rough rock, and open provocation. Instead of trying to be an acceptable band, they seemed determined to annoy as many believers in good manners as possible. Their lyrics talked about sex in blunt terms, made jokes about religion, poked at the government, and mocked traditional values. For friends in the alternative scene, that was liberating. For people who saw rock as a looming threat, it felt almost like a personal attack. As a result, the group attracted attention from people much more powerful than newspaper critics. Reports show that the Fugs were investigated under obscenity laws, and that official agencies kept an eye on their records and performances, worried about the impact of their songs. In some articles, they were described as the worst rock had to offer, vulgar, offensive, and dangerous for young listeners. Precisely because of that, they became a perfect symbol of the counterculture, a kind of stress test for what could or couldn't be said in public. While the underground was fighting this duel with official good taste, television and record labels were busy doing the opposite, assembling bands that were polished to the point of feeling unreal.
Number 4, the Monkees, when a TV band betrayed rock fans. The Monkees began as a television project rather than a traditional band. The idea was simple: create a show about 4 funny, charismatic guys clearly inspired by the Beatles wave. The members were talented, but they were hired mainly as actors. On the early records, most of the music was performed by studio musicians, while professional songwriters delivered the hits. It worked. The show took off, the songs topped the charts, and young audiences embraced the Monkees wholeheartedly. The trouble started when part of that audience discovered how the product was actually assembled. Once it became clear that the band didn't play most of the instruments on their records, a segment of serious rock fans began treating them as a fraud. Critics accused the Monkees of being a fake act built by the industry to fool teenagers. Rock purists adopted a stance of disdain. Liking their music was, for some, the same as admitting you didn't care about authenticity at all. The irony is that the Monkees themselves rebelled against that setup, fought for more creative control, and recorded albums where they did play. Even so, the manufactured band label never fully disappeared. And if a half-fictional group already irritated so many people, the next one barely existed anywhere outside a TV screen.
Number 3. The Archies, the cartoon band that took over the radio. If the Monkees were accused of being constructed, the Archies took that idea one step further. They were a band that didn't exist in real life. They were cartoon characters, having adventures in animated segments while studio musicians recorded the songs behind the scenes. Even so, in 1969, Sugar Sugar exploded on the charts and became one of the most played songs of the year, reaching #1 in several countries and carving the group's presence into pop culture. Over time, though, Sugar Sugar came to be remembered not only as a hit, but also as the ultimate symbol of bubblegum pop. Sticky melodies, lighthearted lyrics, and a sense of product engineered to be consumed and forgotten. Many people began to see the Archies as the perfect representation of completely manufactured music. No real band, no tours, no risk. For listeners who valued authenticity and attitude, that felt almost insulting. Still, it's impossible to deny that the song remains on playlists, soundtracks, and in people's memories to this day. And behind it, there was something bigger. A whole system dedicated to mass producing that kind of sound.
Number 2, 1910 Fruit Gum Company and Ohio Express, The Bubblegum Factory. The term bubblegum music was coined to describe a certain kind of pop, sweet, simple, straightforward, designed to stick quickly and be tossed aside just as fast. Bands like 1910 Fruit Gum Company and Ohio Express were among the key representatives of that style, with tracks such as Simon Says and Yummy Yummy Yummy. Their songs were built around repetitive choruses, easy-to-memorize lyrics, and arrangements crafted to work on both radio and kids' TV shows. For young audiences, it was pure fun. For critics and fans who took rock very seriously, it was almost an aesthetic crime. Bubblegum became the sort of insult, shorthand for shallow, manufactured music with no depth. These bands came to be seen as products of a hit factory, or artists, songwriters, and even band names could be swapped out without making much difference. At the same time, they reveal an important side of the story. While some bands were attacked for being too dangerous, others were hated for being too commercial. And while those hit factories ran at full speed, one family in a small town was preparing a record so strange that many people assumed it had to be a joke.
Number 1, The Shaggs. From worst band ever to cult legend. The story of the Shaggs sounds like an urban legend, but it really happened. 3 sisters from New Hampshire were pushed by their father down an unlikely path. He believed in a kind of family prophecy, claiming his daughters would become major music stars. Even without much experience, they started learning instruments, rehearsing, and in 1969, recorded the album Philosophy of the World. To many ears, the result sounded completely off, clashing beats, odd melodies, and vocals that ignored every familiar standard. Critics did not hold back. For years, the record was labeled one of the worst albums of all time, and the Shaggs were used as a textbook example of what a band should never be. Some people listened to the recordings and laughed. Others felt genuinely uncomfortable, as if they were hearing something so wrong they didn't even know where to begin criticizing it. But time did something unexpected. Musicians, collectors, and scholars started revisiting those tracks and finding in them a kind of brutal honesty, an accidental aesthetic that seemed to anticipate the spirit of alternative and lo-fi rock. What was once treated purely as a joke began to be seen as a cult item. The Shaggs stopped being just the worst band ever and became a symbol of how music history is full of extremes. Forced projects, overblown hatred, and rejections that decades later are interpreted completely differently. Ending the list with them is almost a summary of the whole video. What one era rejects may be exactly what another generation embraces with enthusiasm. Looking at these 10 bands isn't just about pointing fingers and deciding who was good or bad. It's about seeing how musical hatred almost always reveals more about the historical moment than about the quality of the songs themselves.
In some cases, it was parents and authorities terrified of drugs, sex, rebellion, and new ideas. In others, it was fans feeling betrayed by bands they saw as too commercial, too manufactured, or too bold. And in many situations, it was simply fear of the unknown, fear of not knowing where all of this was going. What's most intriguing is that many of these bands are now loved, respected, or at least treated with much more generous curiosity. Records that once went into bonfires became collector's items. Songs that were dismissed as garbage started being cited as major influencers. In the end, the 10 most hated bands of the 60s is less a list of condemnation and more of a mirror. It shows how we react when something pushes our limits. If you made it this far, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel keep bringing these hidden music stories. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next videos. And now I want to hear from you. Which 60s band do you think was hated unfairly, and which one do you think deserved every bit of criticism it got? Drop your answer in the comments and let's keep this conversation going there.